A philosopher who never wanted to be one rewrote the rules of government without raising an army. His name appears on buildings across the world, yet most people couldn't tell you what he actually did. He lived in luxury, wrote in secret, and changed everything about how power works in the modern state. Charles Louis de Secondat, Baron de la Brède et de Montesquieu was born on January 18, 1689, in the Château de la Brède, about 10 miles south of Bordeaux. The timing mattered. France was exhausted. King Louis XIV had been on the throne for nearly half a century, draining the country through endless wars and extravagant building projects. The peasants starved while Versailles glittered. Into this world of extremes came a child who would spend his life thinking about why some governments worked and others collapsed under their own weight. The chateau where Montesquieu entered the world still stands today, surrounded by moats and vineyards. It's the kind of place that teaches you from birth about hierarchy, about the weight of history, about knowing your position in an ancient order. His family wasn't royalty, but they were solidly noble, the kind of people who'd held their lands for generations and expected to hold them for generations more. His father, Jacques de Secondat, was a soldier, not the kind who sought glory, but the kind who did his duty and came home. His mother, Marie-Françoise de Pesnel, brought significant wealth to the marriage through her family's estates. This wasn't a love match in any romantic sense. This was how things worked. Families merged, properties consolidated, bloodlines continued. But here's what nobody expected. When Montesquieu was 7 years old, his mother died. The boy who would later write about the laws that govern societies first learned about the law that governs all human life. Nothing is permanent. Everything changes. Even the structures that seem eternal can vanish overnight. His father remarried. The household continued. Life moved forward because that's what life does. But something had shifted in the young Charles Louis. The child who'd lost his mother early developed the habit of watching, of observing how things actually worked rather than how people said they worked. His education began at home, as it did for all noble children. Tutors came and went, teaching him Latin, Greek, the classics that every educated person was expected to know. He was good at it, more than good. The boy had a mind that absorbed information and then did something unexpected with it. He didn't just memorize, he questioned. At 11, he was sent to the Collège de Juilly, a school run by the Oratorians near Paris. This wasn't just any school. The Oratorians were different from the Jesuits, who dominated Catholic education. They believed in teaching students how to think, not just what to think. They emphasized science, modern languages, and critical reasoning. For 5 years, Montesquieu studied there. He learned history, but not as a series of dates to memorize. He learned it as a pattern, as a story of how societies rise and fall, how power shifts, how the same problems appear again and again in different costumes. The Roman Republic became the Roman Empire. The empire collapsed. New kingdoms rose from the ruins. Why? What was the pattern underneath? He graduated in 1705, at 16. The next step was obvious. He went to Bordeaux to study law. This wasn't because he burned with passion for legal work. This was what ambitious young nobles did. Law opened doors. It led to positions in government, to influence, to the kind of career his family expected. But while he studied law, something else was happening. Bordeaux wasn't Paris, but it was a major city, a trading hub, a place where ideas moved along with wine and grain. The port brought in ships from around the world. With them came news, books, stories of how other people lived. Montesquieu absorbed it all. He finished his law degree in 1708 at 19. He was now qualified for a career in the judicial system. The path forward seemed clear. Then his father died. Jacques de Secondat passed away in 1713, and suddenly the young law graduate had to think about family responsibilities, about estates, about the practical realities of managing property and tenants, and the 1,000 details that come with being a landlord in Ancien Régime France. But the real change came a year later. In 1714, his uncle, Jean-Baptiste de Secondat, died. This uncle had held an important position. He was president à mortier in the Parlement of Bordeaux, essentially a senior judge in the regional high court. These positions were bought and sold in France. They were property, passed down through families like land or furniture. The uncle had no children. He left everything to his nephew: the chateau, the estates, the fortune, and crucially, that position in the Parlement. At 25, Charles Louis inherited a judicial role that men twice his age would envy. There was a condition. He had to marry his uncle's widow, Jeanne de Lartigue. She was Protestant, which complicated things in Catholic France, but she was also wealthy, very wealthy. The marriage happened in 1715. Was there affection? Perhaps. Was there a choice? Not really. This was how inheritances worked, how fortunes stayed in families. They would have 3 children together, 2 daughters and a son. The son would inherit the estates. The daughters would marry well. The family would continue. Everything proceeded according to the ancient patterns. Montesquieu took his seat in the Parlement of Bordeaux. He was now Baron de Montesquieu, a title that came with the inherited estates. He had position, wealth, a family, a career. By every measure his society recognised, he'd succeeded before he was 30, and he was desperately bored. The work of a parliamentarian in provincial France was tedious. Cases about property disputes, inheritance squabbles, commercial disagreements, important to the people involved, certainly. But not exactly the kind of thing that engaged a mind that wanted to understand why civilizations rose and fell. So he started writing. Not legal briefs, not the kind of writing his position required. He wrote essays about whatever caught his attention, scientific observations about the echo in the forest near his chateau, speculations about why the Romans worshipped particular gods, thoughts on the nature of wealth and what made nations prosperous. He joined the Academy of Bordeaux in 1716, a learned society where educated men gathered to discuss ideas. These academics existed throughout France, little pockets of intellectual life outside the universities. Montesquieu read papers on kidney diseases, on the transparency of ancient glass, on why women's voices were different from men's. Nothing about these papers suggested revolutionary political thought. They were the work of a curious mind playing with ideas, testing theories, seeing what happened when you applied reason to questions nobody had thought to ask systematically. But underneath something was building. All those observations, all that reading about how different societies organised themselves, all those questions about why things were the way they were accumulating, connecting, forming into a larger structure he couldn't quite see yet. In 1721, when Montesquieu was 32, something extraordinary happened. A book appeared in Amsterdam, published anonymously. Its title was Persian Letters. The premise was simple. 2 Persian noblemen, Uzbek and Rika, travel to France and write letters home describing what they see. The letters also tell the story of Uzbek's harem back in Persia, which gradually falls into chaos while he's away. The book was a sensation. Readers across Europe devoured it. Multiple editions appeared within a year. Everyone wanted to know who'd written it. The genius of Persian Letters wasn't just its wit, though it was very witty. The genius was the perspective. By making his observers foreigners, Montesquieu could say things about French society that would have been dangerous coming from a Frenchman. The Persians could marvel at the absurdity of French customs, question why the king had such absolute power, wonder why the church held such influence, observe the poverty alongside the luxury, all while appearing to be innocent outsiders simply reporting what they saw. It was satire, but satire with teeth. And underneath the humour was serious political philosophy. How should societies be organised? What gives rulers legitimate authority? What happens when power isn't checked by other powers? Montesquieu never officially admitted authorship during his lifetime. Everyone knew anyway. The style, the concerns, the way the book engaged with questions that obsessed the Baron de Montesquieu. It was obvious. The book made him famous. Suddenly he wasn't just a provincial judge. He was an author, a thinker, someone whose work mattered beyond Bordeaux. But fame brought danger too. The book criticised absolute monarchy. It questioned religious authority. These weren't safe positions in France, where the king ruled by divine right and the Catholic Church still burned books it didn't like. Montesquieu was careful. He remained in Bordeaux, performed his judicial duties, stayed outwardly respectable. He'd learned something important. You could say radical things if you said them cleverly, if you wrapped them in enough layers of irony and fictional distance that you could deny what you were really doing. The success of Persian letters changed his life in practical ways. He began to correspond with intellectuals across Europe. Letters arrived from Paris, from London, from Amsterdam. People wanted to meet him, to discuss ideas, to hear what he thought about the questions of the day. In 1728, Montesquieu made a decision. He sold his position in the Parlement. These judicial offices were property, remember. You could sell them like you'd sell a house. He'd held the position for 14 years, and he was done with it. The sale gave him financial independence. Between the money from the office, his inherited estates, and the income from his vineyards, he didn't need to work. He could do what he'd wanted to do all along. He could think. But Montesquieu wasn't the kind of thinker who stayed in his study. He wanted to see the world, to test his theories against reality, to understand how different societies actually functioned rather than just reading about them. In April 1728, he left France. He was 39 years old, financially secure, intellectually restless, and about to embark on a journey that would fundamentally shape everything he later wrote. His first stop was Vienna. The Habsburg capital was nothing like Bordeaux. Here was the centre of an empire that stretched across Europe, a place where different peoples, languages and cultures collided and somehow held together under one crown. He stayed several months, observing, taking notes, asking questions. How did the Habsburgs govern such diverse territories? What held the empire together when it had no common language, no unified culture? From Vienna he travelled to Hungary, then to Italy. Venice fascinated him. Here was a republic, not a monarchy, a city that had governed itself for centuries through elaborate systems of councils and elections designed to prevent any one person or family from gaining too much power. He studied how it worked. The Great Council, the Senate, the Doge, who held ceremonial authority but limited real power. It was a machine designed to balance competing interests, to make sure no faction could dominate. Rome was different again. Once the capital of an empire that ruled the known world, now the headquarters of a church that claimed spiritual authority over all Christendom. He walked through ruins and cathedrals, thinking about how power changes forms, but never disappears. After Italy came Germany, a patchwork of principalities and free cities, each with its own laws and customs. Then the Netherlands, where commerce had created wealth on a scale that rivaled the great kingdoms, despite having a fraction of their territory. And then, in November 1729, Montesquieu arrived in England. He would stay for nearly 2 years. England would change everything he thought about government. London, in 1729, was the largest city Montesquieu had ever seen. Nearly 700,000 people crammed into a maze of streets that sprawled along both banks of the Thames. The noise was overwhelming. Carriages clattered over cobblestones. Street vendors shouted their wares. The air smelled of coal smoke, sewage, and the river itself, which served as highway, sewer, and commercial artery all at once. But what struck Montesquieu most wasn't the size or the chaos. It was the freedom. Walk through London and you'd see things that would get you arrested in Paris. Newspapers and pamphlets sold openly on every corner, many of them viciously attacking the government, the king, or individual ministers by name. Coffee houses where anyone with a penny could sit for hours reading these papers and arguing about politics. Theatres performing plays that mocked authority. Bookshops displaying works that would be burned by the censors back home. This wasn't anarchy. London had laws, courts, police. But something fundamental was different here. The English seemed to operate under a set of assumptions about what government could and couldn't do that had no equivalent in France. Montesquieu set out to understand why. He had letters of introduction from friends in France, and these opened doors. He was invited to dinners, to clubs, to private meetings with politicians and writers. He attended sessions of Parliament. He visited courts. He talked to merchants, lawyers, aristocrats, and anyone else who would explain how England actually worked. What he discovered was a system nobody had quite planned. The English Constitution wasn't written down in a single document. It was a collection of laws, customs, precedents, and compromises accumulated over centuries. The result looked messy. It was messy, but it functioned in ways that the neat, logical, centralised French system did not. Start with Parliament. It had two houses. The House of Lords represented the hereditary aristocracy and the bishops of the Church of England. The House of Commons represented everyone else, though everyone else meant property-owning men, maybe 2% of the population. Still, that was 2% more than had any representation in France. Parliament controlled taxation. The king couldn't raise money without their consent. This was huge. It meant the crown depended on Parliament, not the other way around, and Parliament used that leverage ruthlessly. They'd granted money for wars, then attached conditions. They'd threatened to withhold funds unless the king addressed their grievances. Over time, this dynamic had shifted power steadily away from the monarch and toward the representatives. But here's what really interested Montesquieu. Parliament didn't just control the purse, it made laws. The king could veto legislation technically, but the last time a monarch had actually done so was decades earlier. In practice, Parliament was supreme in its sphere. The courts were something else entirely. English judges were independent. They held their positions for life, couldn't be fired by the king, and their salaries were guaranteed by law. This meant they could rule against the government without fear of losing their jobs. And they did. Montesquieu attended trials where judges threw out cases brought by the crown, citing ancient rights and precedents that protected individuals from arbitrary power. He saw juries of ordinary citizens acquitting defendants the government wanted convicted. The courts operated as a separate power centre, not as an arm of royal authority. Then there was the king himself. George II ruled England, but he ruled within constraints his French counterpart would have found intolerable. He couldn't make law on his own. He couldn't tax on his own. He couldn't maintain a standing army without Parliament's annual approval. He couldn't even spend money without accounting for it to elected officials. What struck Montesquieu was how this division of power created stability rather than chaos. In France, all power flowed through the king. If the king was weak or incompetent or insane, the entire system broke down. France had experienced this repeatedly. Civil wars, regencies, royal minorities, periods when nobles fought over a throne occupied by a child or a madman. England had been through similar chaos. The Civil War of the 1640s had seen Parliament execute a king. The Glorious Revolution of 1688 had driven another king into exile. But the English had learned from these catastrophes. Instead of centralising more power to prevent disorder, they'd divided it. They'd created a system where no single person or institution could dominate completely. The genius was in the balance. Parliament checked the king checked Parliament. The courts checked both, and underneath it all was the common law, that vast body of precedent accumulated over centuries, which constrained everyone. Montesquieu spent hours in coffee houses listening to political debates. What amazed him was how openly people discussed their government's flaws. In France, Criticising the king could land you in prison. Here, members of parliament gave speeches attacking royal policy. Newspapers printed these speeches verbatim. Ordinary citizens read them and formed opinions. This wasn't because the English were inherently more free-thinking than the French. It was because the structure of government made criticism safe. A writer who attacked a minister in print might be sued for libel, but he wouldn't be arrested by royal command and thrown in the Bastille without trial. The courts would hear the case. A jury would decide. There was process, predictability, protection. The economic implications were profound. English merchants operated with confidence that the government wouldn't arbitrarily seize their property or change the rules overnight. When Parliament passed a law, it stayed passed unless Parliament changed it. This stability attracted investment, encouraged innovation, made long-term planning possible. France had talented merchants and craftsmen too, but they operated in a system where a royal decree could destroy their business on a whim, where taxes changed unpredictably, where connections at court mattered more than competence. The most talented French merchants often invested their money in government offices or estates rather than in expanding their businesses because those were the only truly secure forms of property. Montesquieu saw the consequences everywhere he looked in London. The city's commercial vitality, its bustling ports, its banks and trading companies, all of it rested on a foundation of legal predictability that France lacked. He also noticed something about English society that would have been impossible in France. Class lines existed, but they were permeable. A successful merchant could buy land, live like a gentleman, marry his daughter to a minor aristocrat. The aristocracy wasn't a closed caste. It absorbed successful commoners, renewed itself with commercial wealth. This mixing had political effects. Lords who had business interests understood trade. Merchants who owned land understood agriculture. The commons and the lords weren't completely separate worlds. Ideas and interests flowed between them. Montesquieu attended the theatre regularly. The plays were often political, satirizing government corruption or social hypocrisy. He saw the Beggar's Opera, which made explicit parallels between criminals and politicians. The audience loved it. The government tolerated it. This would have been unthinkable in France. He visited the Royal Society, where scientists and natural philosophers gathered to discuss their work. Here was another kind of freedom. Men could propose theories, conduct experiments, challenge received wisdom without worrying whether their conclusions offended religious or political authority. Isaac Newton had been dead for 2 years when Montesquieu arrived, but his influence was everywhere. The English celebrated Newton as a hero, not because he'd served the state, but because he'd discovered truth. This was revealing. In France, glory came from serving the king. In England, achievement itself brought recognition, regardless of whether it benefited the crown. Montesquieu took extensive notes. His observations filled notebook after notebook. He wasn't just describing what he saw, he was analysing it, trying to understand the principles that made it work. One principle became increasingly clear. Liberty wasn't an accident. It was a product of institutional design. The English weren't more virtuous than the French. They were probably less virtuous in some ways. Their politics were corrupt, their elections sometimes bought and sold, their politicians frequently self-serving. But the system limited how much damage any individual or faction could do. Think about it. A corrupt minister in France had almost unlimited power as long as he maintained the king's favour. A corrupt minister in England faced parliamentary investigations, press criticism, and the knowledge that his opponents would eventually return to power and might prosecute him. Bad people existed everywhere. The question was whether your system of government assumed people would behave well or planned for the likelihood that they wouldn't. England planned for human weakness. The system didn't require virtuous leaders. It worked with flawed ones because it prevented any single point of failure. This was the insight that would shape everything Montesquieu later wrote. Political liberty doesn't come from good intentions or enlightened rulers. It comes from structure, from the division and balance of power, from institutions that check each other so that no single authority can become tyrannical. France had no such balance. The king was sovereign. The parliament could delay but not block. The church had influence but no independent power. Everything ultimately depended on who sat on the throne and what kind of person he was. Montesquieu had lived under Louis XIV's absolute monarchy and seen its costs. He was living under Louis XV's weaker version and seeing different problems. England showed him an alternative. Not a perfect system, but a stable one. Not government by angels, but government that worked with ordinary fallible humans. He stayed in England until May 1731. By then he'd seen enough. He'd attended Parliament, observed the courts, studied the Constitution, talked to everyone who would talk to him. He'd absorbed the principles that made English liberty possible. The journey home took several months. He travelled through the Netherlands again, then back through Germany. He reached Bordeaux in the spring of 1731, 3 years after he'd left. He was 42 years old now. He'd seen more of Europe than most people would see in a lifetime. He'd studied different systems of government, different cultures, different ways of organising society, and he'd developed ideas that were dangerous to express openly. He settled back into his estate at La Brede. The vineyards needed attention. The buildings needed repairs. He'd been gone a long time, and the property had suffered from his absence. But he wasn't done thinking. If anything, the travels had made him more determined to write. He'd seen what worked and what didn't. He'd observed systems that protected liberty and systems that crushed it. He had things to say about power, about government, about how societies could organise themselves to be both stable and free. The question was how to say these things without getting arrested. He started writing, not a treatise or a manifesto, something more subtle. He would write about Rome, ancient history. Nobody could object to a book about events that happened 2,000 years ago, except that anyone with eyes could see he was really writing about France, about how republics fall, about how liberty dies, about the mechanisms by which free societies transform themselves into tyrannies. The book would take him 7 years to complete. It would be called Considerations on the Causes of the Greatness of the Romans and Their Decline, and it would be only the beginning. After Rome, he would turn his attention to something far more ambitious, a comprehensive study of laws, governments, and political systems across all of human history. That project would consume 2 decades of his life and produce a book that would help ignite a revolution. But first he had to figure out how to write it without getting himself killed. Montesquieu returned to La Brede in 1731 and immediately confronted a problem he hadn't anticipated. He was broke. 3 years of travelling across Europe, staying in decent lodgings, buying books, entertaining contacts, had drained his finances. The estate needed investment he couldn't afford. The vineyards were struggling. His wife had managed things as best she could, but she wasn't equipped to run a commercial wine operation alone. He needed income. The problem was that writing philosophy didn't pay. Books made money for publishers, not authors, unless you were willing to produce popular trash, which Montesquieu absolutely was not. Writing was a luxury pursuit for people who didn't need the money. So he did what practical aristocrats did. He worked his land. He studied agriculture. He experimented with different grape varieties, trying to improve the quality of his wines. He corresponded with other landowners about farming techniques. He became, somewhat improbably, an expert on viticulture. The wine business stabilized his finances, but it consumed time he wanted to spend thinking. He carved out hours in the morning for writing before the demands of the estate pulled him away. He worked in his study, surrounded by the books he'd collected during his travels, developing ideas that were becoming increasingly radical. The project that occupied him was the book on Rome. He'd started it before leaving for England, set it aside during his travels, and now returned to it with fresh perspective. The concept was straightforward. He would trace the rise and fall of the Roman Republic and Empire, analysing the causes of its greatness and the reasons for its collapse. But the real subject wasn't Rome, it was political decay. How free societies lose their freedom, how republics transform into tyrannies, how the mechanisms of liberty, if not properly maintained, become instruments of oppression. Every French reader would understand. He was describing their own country's trajectory. The Roman Senate becoming irrelevant, while emperors accumulated absolute power. The corruption of civic virtue by luxury and decadence. The replacement of citizen armies with mercenaries loyal only to whoever paid them. The collapse of institutions that once protected liberty. This was dangerous territory, but Montesquieu had learned from his earlier troubles with the Persian letters. He wrote carefully. He never explicitly compared Rome to France. He let readers draw their own conclusions, and he framed everything as historical analysis, which gave him plausible deniability. The writing went slowly. He was meticulous, checking every historical source, verifying every claim. He knew the book would be scrutinized by people looking for reasons to suppress it. It had to be bulletproof. 7 years passed. The manuscript grew. He revised relentlessly, cutting passages that were too provocative, strengthening arguments that seemed weak, adding examples that illustrated his points. In 1734, he sent the completed manuscript to a publisher in Amsterdam. Publishing abroad was standard practice for controversial books. French censors had no jurisdiction over Dutch presses, and books printed in the Netherlands could be smuggled back into France. Considerations on the causes of the greatness of the Romans and their decline appeared in 1734. The title was deliberately dry, suggesting scholarly detachment rather than political commentary. The content was anything but detached. Montesquieu argued that Rome's greatness came from its institutions, the division of power between consuls, senate, and popular assemblies, the rule of law that applied even to the powerful, the civic virtue that made citizens willing to sacrifice personal interest for the common good, the military discipline that came from citizens defending their own republic rather than mercenaries fighting for pay. Rome fell, he argued, when these institutions decayed, when power concentrated in fewer hands, when law became whatever the emperor said it was, when civic virtue gave way to corruption and self-interest, when the army became a tool of whoever could pay it rather than defenders of republican liberty. The parallels to contemporary France were impossible to miss. Louis XIV had concentrated power in himself, just as the Roman emperors had. French institutions that once checked royal authority had been neutered. Civic virtue had been replaced by court intrigue and the pursuit of royal favour. The French military served the king, not France. The book was a success, though not a massive one. It sold steadily among educated readers. It was discussed in salons and coffee houses. It established Montesquieu as a serious political thinker, not just a witty author of the Persian letters. More importantly, it was a trial run for the much larger project he was already planning. If he could write about Rome safely, he could write about everything. He just needed to be careful about how he did it. By 1734, Montesquieu was 55 years old. Most men his age were winding down, preparing for retirement, settling into comfortable routines. He was ramping up for the most ambitious intellectual project of his life. He wanted to write a comprehensive study of laws and governments across all human societies, past and present, European and non-European, monarchies, republics, despotisms. He would examine what made each system work or fail, what conditions produced liberty and what conditions destroyed it, how geography, climate, religion, commerce, and customs shaped political institutions. It was an insanely ambitious plan. No one had ever attempted anything like it. Political philosophy traditionally dealt with abstract principles, not empirical comparison of actual systems. Montesquieu wanted to ground political theory in observation of how governments actually functioned. The research would take decades. He needed to read histories of every major civilization, study the laws of different nations, analyze travel accounts from around the world, understand how climate affected agriculture, which affected population, which affected military capacity, which affected political organization. He started accumulating materials. He subscribed to journals. He corresponded with scholars across Europe. He hired assistants to help with research. His library at La Brede grew to over 3,000 volumes, enormous for a private collection. The scope kept expanding. He'd planned a single volume, then 2 volumes. Then he realized he was writing something that would fill multiple volumes and take the rest of his life. His eyesight was failing. He'd always had poor vision, but by his 50s he was going blind. He could barely read without powerful magnifying glasses. Writing was agony. He had to hold his face close to the page, straining to see the words he was forming. He hired secretaries to read to him and take dictation, but this created its own problems. Some ideas were too sensitive to dictate. Some arguments needed to be worked out on paper, where he could see them whole. He struggled on, writing when his eyes allowed, dictating when they didn't. The work consumed him. He spent mornings writing, afternoons reading or having books read to him, evenings discussing ideas with visitors. He took breaks to manage his estate, but his mind was always on the project. Friends worried he was killing himself. His wife worried. His health was declining along with his vision, but he couldn't stop. This was the work he'd been building toward his entire life. Everything else had been preparation. He worked through the 1730s and into the 1740s. The manuscript grew to staggering length. He filled notebooks with observations, arguments, examples. He drafted chapters, threw them out, redrafted them. He reorganized the entire structure multiple times. The central insight that drove everything was the idea he'd developed watching England's Parliament. Liberty doesn't come from good intentions or enlightened rulers. It comes from structure, from institutions that divide power so no one can accumulate enough to become tyrannical. But the insight needed elaboration. What kind of structure? Under what conditions? How do you create institutions that balance power without paralyzing government? How do you maintain those institutions once established? What causes them to decay? He developed a typology of governments, republics, monarchies, and despotisms, each with its own organizing principle. Republics run on virtue, the willingness of citizens to put public good ahead of private interest. Monarchies run on honor, the desire for distinction and recognition within a hierarchical order. Despotisms run on fear. Each system had strengths and vulnerabilities. Republics could be virtuous but fragile, prone to faction and civil war. Monarchies could be stable but required careful balance of competing powers. Despotisms were simple but brutal, stable only through terror. Climate and geography shaped which systems could succeed where. Hot climates produced despotism because the heat made people passive and submissive. Cold climates produced free government because harsh conditions bred hardy, independent people. Moderate climates could support any system depending on other factors. This was crude by modern standards, bordering on environmental determinism, but it was sophisticated for its time, an attempt to ground political theory in material conditions rather than abstract principles. Commerce was a civilizing force. Trade required contract law, property rights, predictability. Merchant societies developed institutions that protected liberty because merchants needed liberty to operate. This was why England, a commercial nation, had developed free government, while agricultural France remained absolutist. Religion mattered too. Protestantism encouraged individual judgment and thus political freedom. Catholicism emphasized hierarchy, and submission to authority, supporting absolute monarchy. Islam, in Montesquieu's view, naturally produced despotism through its emphasis on submission to God's will as interpreted by rulers. These generalizations don't hold up to scrutiny. Catholic Switzerland was free while Protestant Prussia was absolutist. But Montesquieu was groping towards something important, the idea that culture, economy, and politics are interconnected, that you can't understand government without understanding society. The manuscript kept growing. By 1745, he had something like a complete draft, though he wasn't happy with it. The structure felt loose. Some arguments contradicted others. The whole thing needed tightening. He spent 2 more years revising, cutting redundant sections, clarifying arguments, adding examples, removing passages that were too provocative. He was 70 years old now, nearly blind, physically exhausted. But the book was nearly done. He titled it The Spirit of the Laws, because he wasn't just cataloguing legal systems. He was trying to capture the underlying principles, the spirit that animated different kinds of law in different societies. It was a deliberately vague title. It suggested philosophy rather than political commentary. Readers would discover soon enough that the book was explosive. In 1748, Montesquieu sent the manuscript to a publisher in Geneva. Again, foreign publication to avoid French censors. Again, anonymous authorship for protection. The Spirit of the Laws appeared in October 1748 in 2 volumes totaling over 1,000 pages. It was dense, difficult, organised in a way that sometimes seemed random. Montesquieu had arranged it as a series of short chapters, some only a page or 2, jumping from topic to topic. The strategy was deliberate. The fragmented structure made it harder for critics to extract and attack specific arguments. The brevity of individual chapters made the book feel less intimidating than its length suggested. The topical organisation let readers skip around, finding sections that interested them. What they found was revolutionary. Hidden in the dense prose and scholarly apparatus was a blueprint for destroying absolute monarchy and creating free government through institutional design. Book 11, Chapter 6 was the heart of it, the chapter on the English Constitution. Here Montesquieu laid out his theory of separation of powers with devastating clarity. Political liberty exists only when power is divided among different branches of government that check each other. Legislative, executive, and judicial powers must be separate. If they're combined in one person or body, liberty is impossible. England had achieved this separation. Not perfectly, but adequately. Parliament made laws. The king executed them. Independent courts judged cases. Each branch could restrain the others. No single authority could become tyrannical because the other branches would block it. France had no such separation. The king made laws, executed them, and controlled the courts. He was sovereign in every domain. This was the definition of despotism, however enlightened individual kings might be. The implication was clear. France needed to reorganize its government along English lines, divide power, create independent institutions, establish checks and balances. Only then could Frenchmen be free. This was sedition dressed as scholarship. Montesquieu had just told his readers that their government was despotic and needed fundamental restructuring. He'd provided a detailed blueprint for how to restructure it, and he'd done it in a book that would be read across Europe and eventually across the Atlantic, where a group of colonial rebels would use it to design a new nation. The reaction was immediate and catastrophic. The Spirit of the Laws sold out its first printing within days. Pirated editions appeared across Europe. Within a year, over 20 editions were circulating. Some authorized, most not. Everyone was reading it. Nobles, clergy, merchants, lawyers, the educated public devoured it. This was exactly what Montesquieu had feared. The book's success made it impossible to ignore. The French authorities couldn't pretend it didn't exist. The Church moved first. In November 1751, 3 years after publication, the Faculty of Theology at the Sorbonne condemned the spirit of the laws. They compiled a list of objectionable propositions. Montesquieu's relativism about religion, his suggestion that different climates suited different faiths, his praise for pagan republics, his failure to acknowledge Christianity's absolute superiority. The list went on. The condemnation was serious. Books condemned by the Sorbonne often ended up on the papal index of forbidden books. That would ban it across Catholic Europe. Worse, royal censors might move from ecclesiastical to political charges. Sedition carried harsher penalties than heresy. Montesquieu needed to respond. Not by retreating, but by defending his work in a way that diffused the immediate threat without compromising his arguments. He published a Defense of the Spirit of the Laws in 1750. The strategy was clever. He addressed the theological objections with apparent earnestness, clarifying passages that the Sorbonne had misunderstood. He insisted he was a devout Catholic, writing as a political analyst, not a theologian. The climatic theory of religion, merely an observation about how different peoples practice faith, not a claim that all religions are equal. The praise for pagan republics, historical analysis, not moral endorsement. Christianity remained supreme, obviously. The defense was sophisticated enough to create doubt among his critics. Was Montesquieu genuinely orthodox, just misunderstood? Or was he cunningly deflecting accusations while leaving his dangerous ideas intact? Both interpretations were possible. That was the point. The tactic worked. The Sorbonne's condemnation stalled. The book remained controversial, but not officially banned in France. Montesquieu had bought himself space. But the intellectual battle was just beginning. Critics attacked from multiple directions. Defenders of absolute monarchy argued that unified power was necessary for order. Division created chaos and weakness. They pointed to English history, civil war in the 17th century, constant faction fighting, political instability. Was this the model Montesquieu recommended? Religious authorities insisted that legitimate government came from God, not institutional mechanics. Kings ruled by divine right. Creating checks on royal power was creating checks on God's appointed authority. Political philosophers in the rationalist tradition argued that Montesquieu's empiricism was shallow. He'd observed different governments and described them. Fine, but where were the universal principles? Where was the deductive reasoning from first premises? He'd given them a catalogue when they needed a system. Montesquieu's defenders, and there were many, countered that his empiricism was precisely what made the work valuable. Abstract political theories failed because they ignored reality. Montesquieu had studied actual governments, actual societies, actual history. His conclusions were grounded in evidence, not speculation. The separation of powers wasn't a utopian fantasy. It existed in England. It could be replicated elsewhere, but the most important readers weren't the professors and clerics arguing in Paris. They were across the Atlantic. In British North America, educated colonists were reading Montesquieu with intense interest. These were men with grievances against their own government, men who felt that distant British authority was becoming tyrannical, men who would soon need to design new institutions. They found in Montesquieu exactly what they needed: a theory of how to construct free government, a working model in the English Constitution, a warning about what happens when power concentrates, a vocabulary for talking about rights and liberty and institutional balance. The Spirit of the Laws became one of the most cited works in American political writing during the Revolutionary period. When the founders gathered in Philadelphia in 1787 to write the Constitution, Montesquieu's ghost was in the room. The structure they created, executive, legislative, judicial branches, each with defined powers, each able to check the others, was Montesquieuan. James Madison's Federalist papers quoted him repeatedly. John Adams called him one of the greatest geniuses who ever lived. Thomas Jefferson owned multiple editions of his works. The American experiment in republican government was built on French intellectual foundations. Montesquieu wouldn't live to see it. His health had been declining for years. The eye problems that had plagued him since childhood worsened. By 1754, he was nearly blind. He could barely read. Writing was impossible. He spent his final months at his estate, dictating letters, receiving visitors, reflecting on a life spent thinking about how human beings could live together in freedom. He died in Paris on February 10, 1755, at age 66. The cause was fever, probably pneumonia. He'd caught cold while in the city dealing with his publisher. The illness progressed quickly. Within days he was bedridden. He asked for a priest, made confession, received last rites. Whatever his private religious doubts, he died a Catholic. The funeral was modest. He was buried in the chapel of Saint-Sulpice. No grand monuments, no state recognition. Just another aristocrat laid to rest, but his ideas were spreading like wildfire. The French Revolution was still decades away, but the intellectual groundwork was laid. When revolutionaries began dismantling the old regime in 1789, they did it with Montesquieu's vocabulary: separation of powers, checks and balances, constitutional limits on authority. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen echoed his principles. The Revolutionary Constitution of 1791 tried to implement them, though poorly. Later revolutionary governments abandoned separation of powers for concentrated authority, proving Montesquieu's point about what happens when power isn't divided. But beyond France, beyond the specific mechanics of government design, Montesquieu had changed how people thought about politics itself. Before him, political philosophy was largely about finding the best form of government, the ideal system that would work everywhere. After him, it became about understanding that different societies need different institutions, that climate, culture, history all shape what's possible politically, that you can't impose systems from the outside. They have to grow from local conditions. He'd also introduced a new way of studying politics, empirical, comparative, focused on how things actually work rather than how they should work in theory. This was political science before the term existed. Modern sociology begins here too. Montesquieu's insistence on studying society as a system, where laws, customs, religion, and economics all interact, created a template for later thinkers. Émile Durkheim, the founder of academic sociology, called Montesquieu his predecessor. The influence stretched into economics. Montesquieu's analysis of how commerce softens manners, how trade creates interdependence between nations, how economic freedom supports political freedom, these ideas shaped Adam Smith. The Wealth of Nations, published 2 decades after Montesquieu's death, developed economic arguments that paralleled his political ones. Markets work through dispersed decision-making, no central authority. Order emerges from countless individual choices. The same principle as separation of powers. Even his critics absorbed his methods. When Jean-Jacques Rousseau attacked Montesquieu's conclusions, he did it using Montesquieu's analytical tools. When Edmund Burke defended British institutions against French revolutionary radicalism, he used arguments about tradition and local custom that Montesquieu had pioneered. You can't understand modern political thought without understanding Montesquieu. He's everywhere, even when he's not cited. Every time someone argues for divided government, they're echoing him. Every time someone warns about concentration of power, they're channeling him. Every time someone insists that laws must fit the society they govern, they're following him. The United States Constitution is his monument. 3 branches: separation of powers, checks and balances, Federalism dividing authority between national and state governments. It's all Montesquieuan architecture. The system has survived nearly 2.5 centuries, longer than any other written constitution, precisely because it embodies his insights about how to prevent tyranny through institutional design. Other nations copied the model: Latin American republics, European democracies after monarchy collapsed, post-colonial governments trying to establish stable rule. The basic template: divide power among branches, create checks, protect rights through structure, spread globally. Not always successfully. Separation of powers on paper doesn't guarantee it in practice. Montesquieu knew that. He'd studied plenty of governments with fine-sounding laws and despotic reality. But the aspiration matters. The idea that government should be limited, that power should be divided, that citizens should be protected from arbitrary authority. These aren't natural assumptions. For most of human history, the default was concentrated power. Kings, emperors, chiefs, whoever ruled did so with minimal constraints. Montesquieu helped create the intellectual foundation for challenging that default. He showed how to think systematically about limiting power through design rather than hoping for benevolent rulers. His personal life was quieter than his intellectual impact. He'd married young, an arranged match to a Protestant woman from a wealthy family. Jeanne de l'Artigue brought a substantial dowry. The marriage was companionable rather than passionate. They had 3 children. Montesquieu maintained the estate, fulfilled his social obligations, played the role of provincial nobleman, but his mind was always elsewhere, in Rome, in England, in Persia, in imaginary republics where citizens governed themselves. He travelled extensively in his youth, that grand tour across Europe that shaped his thinking. But after returning to France, he barely left his estate. He didn't need to. He'd seen enough of the world to understand its variety. Now he could think about what it meant. His writing routine was disciplined. Mornings at his desk, research in the afternoon, evenings with family or guests. He maintained correspondence with intellectuals across Europe. The republic of letters connected minds separated by hundreds of miles. He was generous with younger thinkers. When Denis Diderot and Jean-Laurent d'Alembert began working on the Encyclopédie, that massive project to catalogue all human knowledge, Montesquieu contributed articles. He supported the philosophe, the French Enlightenment thinkers, who would push his ideas further than he dared. His influence on Voltaire was direct. They corresponded. Voltaire praised the spirit of the laws extravagantly. He saw in Montesquieu a kindred spirit. Another aristocrat using his privilege to attack privilege, another writer hiding dangerous ideas behind scholarly apparatus. The philosophical partnership between Montesquieu and Voltaire represented something new in European intellectual life. Thinkers collaborating across distance, building on each other's work, creating a shared project of using reason to reform society. The Enlightenment wasn't a movement with headquarters and membership cards. It was a network of minds connected by letters and books, united by belief that human beings could understand their world and improve it through thought. Montesquieu didn't live to see how far that project would go. The full Enlightenment flowering came after his death. The French Revolution, the American Revolution, the gradual spread of liberal democracy, all happened later, but the seeds were planted in the spirit of the laws. His insight that freedom requires institutional structure, not just good intentions, became the operating principle of modern democracy. Walk into any constitutional democracy today, and you're walking through a building Montesquieu designed. The specific architecture varies. Parliamentary systems differ from presidential ones. Federal arrangements differ from unitary states. But the foundation is the same. Divide power, create checks, build institutions that prevent any single authority from becoming absolute. That's his legacy, not in monuments or state funerals, in the structure of government itself. Charles Louis de Secondat, Baron de Montesquieu died on February 10, 1755 in Paris. He was 66 years old. He'd come to the city for the winter, as he often did. The capital offered society, conversation, access to the latest books and ideas. But this winter was different. He fell ill. A fever. It progressed rapidly. Within days he was bedridden. Friends visited, priests came. He received the last rites of the Catholic Church, that final reconciliation between a man and the faith he'd spent decades quietly undermining with reason. The irony wasn't lost on anyone who knew him well. His funeral was modest by aristocratic standards. No elaborate ceremony, no grand monument. He was buried in the church of Saint-Sulpice in Paris. His body would rest there while his ideas travelled the world, crossing oceans, inspiring revolutions, reshaping governments. The obituaries in Paris were respectful but cautious. Montesquieu was famous, yes. The spirit of the laws had made him one of Europe's most discussed thinkers. But he was also controversial. The church had condemned his work. The authorities watched his followers. Praising him too enthusiastically might attract unwanted attention. So the tributes were measured. They acknowledged his brilliance, his erudition, his contribution to political philosophy. They were careful not to emphasize what made him dangerous. That task fell to others. Across the English Channel, thinkers recognized what France had lost. They understood that Montesquieu had given them tools for understanding power that no previous philosopher had provided. The separation of powers wasn't just abstract theory, it was practical blueprint. And practical blueprints changed the world more reliably than utopian manifestos. His estate passed to his son. The chateau at La Brede continued. The vineyards produced their wine. Life went on. But something had shifted. The spirit of the laws didn't disappear into libraries. It spread. Editions multiplied. Translations appeared. English, Italian, German. The book travelled everywhere ideas could go, and everywhere it went, it caused trouble. Comfortable trouble, the kind that makes people question assumptions they'd never thought to question. Why should one man have absolute power? What's the alternative? Montesquieu had answered. Now others would try to implement his answer. The first serious attempt happened across the Atlantic, in 13 colonies that were about to become something unprecedented. A nation built from scratch, starting with nothing but ideas. And the ideas they started with were largely his. The American founders read Montesquieu obsessively. They debated his theories. They tested his logic. They asked whether his analysis of England's constitution could be applied to a republic without a king, whether separation of powers could function in a society without hereditary aristocracy, whether checks and balances could substitute for the traditional foundations of political order. James Madison knew the spirit of the laws practically by heart. He'd studied it at Princeton under John Witherspoon, that Scottish minister turned college president who'd introduced a generation of Americans to Enlightenment political philosophy. Madison returned to it again and again during the constitutional debates. When he drafted the Virginia Plan, the proposal that became the foundation of the American Constitution, Montesquieu's influence was everywhere, not copied directly. Madison wasn't that simple. He adapted, modified, Americanized, but the basic architecture was Montesquieu's: 3 branches of government, each with defined powers, each capable of checking the others. The legislative branch divided into 2 houses, preventing hasty legislation. The executive strong enough to govern, but constrained by law. The judiciary independent, protected from political pressure. This wasn't how governments had traditionally been designed. Traditional governments emerged from conquest, inheritance, tradition. Someone won a war and declared themselves king. Their descendants ruled until someone else won a different war. Legitimacy came from God, from ancient custom, from the barrel of a gun. The American Constitution proposed something radical, a government created by deliberate design, with the explicit goal of preventing tyranny through institutional structure. That's pure Montesquieu. Alexander Hamilton defended the proposed constitution in the Federalist Papers, that series of essays written to convince New York to ratify. In Federalist number 78, he explained why the judiciary needed independence. He quoted Montesquieu directly. "There is no liberty if the power of judging be not separated from the legislative and executive powers." The founding generation didn't hide their debt. They acknowledged it. Montesquieu had shown them how to think about power. They were implementing his insights. The constitution that emerged from Philadelphia in 1787 wasn't perfect. It contained compromises, contradictions, a catastrophic acceptance of slavery that would nearly destroy the nation 70 years later. But its fundamental architecture, the way it divided and balanced power, reflected Montesquieu's analysis, and that architecture survived. It bent under pressure, but didn't break. The Civil War tested it. The Great Depression tested it. 2 world wars tested it. The checks held, sometimes barely, sometimes imperfectly. But they held. That's the ultimate validation of Montesquieu's theory. Not that separation of powers creates perfect government. Nothing creates perfect government, but that it creates resilient government. Government that can survive its own leaders' mistakes. Government that makes tyranny difficult, even when tyranny is attempted. The French Revolution came next, more dramatic, more violent, more willing to completely overturn tradition. The revolutionaries of 1789 read Montesquieu too, but they read him differently. They focused on his analysis of republican virtue, his celebration of ancient Rome, his suggestion that true freedom required citizen participation. They were less interested in checks and balances, more interested in popular sovereignty. The result was chaos. The National Assembly tried to create a constitution incorporating Montesquieu's principles. Separation of powers, yes, but also direct democracy, popular will, the general good. These concepts pulled against each other. The Constitution of 1791 created a weak executive and a powerful legislature. It didn't last 2 years. The revolution spiraled into terror. The guillotine became the ultimate check on power, indiscriminate and bloody. Montesquieu had warned about this. He'd written that democracy requires virtue, that republics depend on citizens' willingness to subordinate private interest to public good, that without this virtue, democracy collapses into tyranny. The terror seemed to prove him right. Maximilien Robespierre claimed to be creating a republic of virtue. He created a dictatorship of paranoia. The French had tried to implement Montesquieu's vision without understanding his warning. They'd focused on the aspiration and ignored the mechanism. They'd wanted freedom but hadn't built the institutions that make freedom sustainable. Napoleon finished what the terror started. He centralized power, eliminated the last vestiges of separation, and created an empire. France went from absolute monarchy through revolutionary chaos to military dictatorship in 15 years. The cycle Montesquieu had described in The Spirit of the Laws, the way republics degenerate into tyranny, played out in real time. But the American experiment continued. Different soil, different result. The Constitution survived its early tests. The peaceful transfer of power from John Adams to Thomas Jefferson in 1801 demonstrated that the system could work. Montesquieu's influence spread beyond America and France. Every new constitution written in the 19th century engaged with his ideas. Some adopted them fully, others rejected them, but none could ignore them. Latin American republics, breaking free from Spanish colonial rule, debated how to structure their governments. Simón Bolívar studied Montesquieu. He understood the theory. He struggled with the practice. Creating separation of powers in societies without strong institutions without traditions of limited government proved harder than the theory suggested. The constitutions were written. The reality often diverged. Caudillos, military strongmen, dominated Latin American politics for generations. The formal separation of powers existed on paper. In practice, power concentrated in whoever commanded the army. This wasn't proof that Montesquieu was wrong. It was proof that institutions require more than documents. They require habits, practices, shared assumptions. They require what Montesquieu had called the spirit of the laws, the underlying cultural and social conditions that make formal rules effective. Europe gradually adopted elements of his framework. The British system evolved. Parliament asserted more power over the Crown. The cabinet system developed, creating a hybrid of legislative and executive authority that Montesquieu hadn't anticipated, but that incorporated his insights about checking power. Even monarchies that remained technically absolute began limiting themselves. Constitutional monarchy emerged as a compromise. The king retained formal authority, but exercised it within constraints defined by law. Prussia, Austria, eventually even Russia experimented with constitutions. Most were granted reluctantly, withdrawn quickly, replaced with something more authoritarian. But the idea persisted. That power should be limited, that government should operate under law, that subjects had rights that rulers must respect. These were revolutionary concepts. Montesquieu hadn't originated all of them, but he'd provided the framework for thinking about how to implement them. His influence extended beyond government structure. His anthropological approach, treating different societies as variations to be studied, rather than deviations from a single correct model, shaped how Europeans thought about the world. The spirit of the laws helped create comparative politics as a field. His insistence that climate, geography, economy, and culture all influenced political systems made simple, universal prescriptions suspect. You couldn't just export England's constitution to India and expect it to work the same way. Context mattered. This relativism was controversial. Critics accused Montesquieu of moral flexibility. If different societies need different governments, does that mean all governments are equally valid? Can tyranny be justified by climate? Montesquieu's answer was nuanced. Different circumstances require different arrangements, but certain principles remain universal. Liberty is always preferable to slavery. Law is always preferable to arbitrary power. Moderate government is always preferable to despotism. The details vary. The fundamentals don't. This balance between universalism and relativism, between insisting on certain absolute values while acknowledging that their implementation varies, became characteristic of liberal political thought. It's still the operating assumption of international human rights law. Certain rights are universal. How societies protect them differs, but the rights themselves aren't negotiable. By the mid-19th century, Montesquieu's influence had become so pervasive that it was nearly invisible. Constitutional government with separated powers wasn't a radical idea anymore. It was the default assumption of progressive politics. Debates weren't about whether to limit power, but how. The specific mechanisms varied. Parliamentary systems distributed power differently than presidential ones. Federal arrangements created different checks than unitary states. But the principle was accepted. Power should be divided. Institutions should check each other. No single authority should control everything. This represented a fundamental shift in human political organization. For thousands of years, the strong ruled the weak, might made right. Kings claimed divine authority. Emperors conquered and governed. The idea that power itself needed to be limited, that even legitimate authority should face constraints, was relatively new. Montesquieu didn't create this idea alone. English thinkers had developed it. American colonists had practiced it. But Montesquieu systematized it. He showed why it worked. He provided the theoretical framework that made limited government intellectually respectable. His personal modesty contrasted with his intellectual ambition. He never claimed to be creating a new political philosophy. He presented himself as an observer, a scientist studying political systems the way Newton studied physics. But observation can be revolutionary. Describing things accurately often reveals that they could be different. The 20th century tested Montesquieu's framework severely. Totalitarian movements rejected the entire premise of limited government. Fascism celebrated the unity of power. Communism promised to eliminate the need for checks by eliminating class conflict. Both claimed that separation of powers was a bourgeois fiction, a mechanism for protecting privilege rather than ensuring freedom. The catastrophes that followed, the tens of millions dead, the societies destroyed, the human potential wasted, vindicated Montesquieu. Concentrated power, even when claimed in the name of the people, led to tyranny. The societies that survived with freedom intact were those that maintained institutional checks. Imperfectly, often inadequately, but they maintained them. The division between democracy and dictatorship in the 20th century largely tracked the division between governments that embraced Montesquieu's insights and those that rejected them. Today we take separation of powers for granted in democratic countries. It seems obvious that courts should be independent, that legislatures should check executives, that no single person should hold all authority. This wasn't obvious to Montesquieu's contemporaries. For them, it was a radical reframing of political possibility. Consider what government looked like across most of the world in 1748. Russia was ruled by an empress whose word was law. The Ottoman Sultan commanded absolutely. Chinese emperors claimed the mandate of heaven. Even in Europe, where parliamentary institutions existed, they were weak. Most European monarchs still governed with minimal constraints. The idea that their power should be deliberately fragmented seemed absurd, dangerous even. Wouldn't division create chaos? Wouldn't splitting authority paralyze government? These were serious objections. Montesquieu's answer was that paralysis was a feature, not a bug. A government that moves too quickly toward tyranny is worse than one that moves slowly toward reform. Better gridlock than dictatorship. Better inefficiency than oppression. This was a hard sell. People instinctively want government to work efficiently. When crisis strikes, when threats emerge, when problems demand solutions, the appeal of unified command becomes powerful. Give one person authority to fix things. Let them act decisively. Stop the bickering and the delays. Montesquieu understood this temptation. He also understood that it led straight to despotism. The price of freedom is sometimes frustration. The cost of liberty is occasionally dysfunction. These aren't flaws in the system, they're protections built into it. His work contained another insight that proved crucial. He recognized that formal constitutional structures weren't enough. You could write separation of powers into a document and still have tyranny. What mattered was whether society actually practiced it, whether the culture supported divided government, whether people valued liberty enough to tolerate inefficiency. This was why he spent so much time analysing English society, not just English law. The English had maintained divided government not because their constitution mandated it, the English constitution wasn't even written down, but because their political culture supported it. Nobles, merchants, clergy and commons all jealously guarded their spheres. None would tolerate domination by another. The balance emerged from competition between power centres. Montesquieu saw that importing institutions without importing the culture that sustained them was pointless. Latin American republics in the 19th century learned this lesson painfully. They copied the United States Constitution almost word for word. Separation of powers, federalism, checks and balances, all the machinery was there. But the societies were different. traditions of caudillo leadership, patterns of patron-client relationships, yet relationships, weak civil institutions, all of this undermined the formal structure. The words on paper couldn't override centuries of political culture. What followed were cycles of dictatorship and instability. The constitutions remained nominally in force even as strong men ruled. Everyone claimed to respect separation of powers while violating it constantly. This wasn't hypocrisy exactly. It was the gap between institutional design and social reality. Montesquieu would have predicted this. He understood that political systems grow from societies. You can't simply transplant them. This created a paradox for reformers. If political culture determines whether institutions work, and institutions shape political culture, how do you break the cycle? How do societies trapped in despotism escape? His answer, implied rather than explicit, was gradual change. You couldn't transform everything overnight. You could begin building the intermediate institutions that make liberty possible: civil associations, independent courts, professional bureaucracies, free press, commercial society. These weren't political in the narrow sense, but they created the social foundation for political freedom. A society with strong voluntary associations doesn't submit easily to tyranny. A society with established property rights has stakeholders in legal order. A society with free commerce develops interests that conflict with arbitrary power. Tocqueville would later elaborate this insight in his study of America. He observed that Americans formed associations for everything. Political causes, yes, but also moral reform, education, entertainment, mutual aid. This habit of voluntary cooperation created citizens who could govern themselves. They didn't need a master because they'd practiced self-organization. The connection to Montesquieu was direct. Tocqueville was working in the same intellectual tradition, exploring how social structures enable or prevent political freedom. Both understood that constitutions don't create free societies. Free societies create constitutions that work. This perspective makes Montesquieu relevant to contemporary debates about democracy promotion. The record of imposing democratic institutions on unprepared societies is mixed at best. Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Egypt during the Arab Spring. The pattern repeats. Outside powers establish elections, write constitutions, train officials. Then things fall apart. Not always immediately. Sometimes the facade holds for years. But eventually, the gap between formal structure and social reality becomes unbridgeable. Does this mean democracy can't spread? That some societies are doomed to tyranny? Montesquieu wouldn't have said that. He believed all societies could move toward greater freedom. But the path varies. Trying to leap directly to full liberal democracy often fails. Building the intermediate institutions, the social foundations, the cultural practices, that takes time. Decades, maybe generations. This isn't what activists want to hear. It's not what politicians can sell, but it's probably true. Consider South Korea and Taiwan. Both were dictatorships in the 1960s. Both are thriving democracies now. The transition took 30 years of gradual liberalization. Economic development created a middle class. Education expanded. Civil society strengthened. By the time formal democratization happened, the social foundations were ready. The institutions could take root because the soil had been prepared. Contrast that with Russia after communism's collapse. Democratic institutions were imposed almost overnight. Elections, political parties, independent media, private property. All the formal structures appeared rapidly, but the social foundations were absent. 70 years of totalitarianism had destroyed civil society. Trust was non-existent. The habit of self-organization had been stamped out. People had learned that power was something done to you, not something you shared in. The result was predictable to anyone who'd read Montesquieu carefully. The formal democracy collapsed, not immediately, but steadily. Power concentrated again. Checks eroded. The constitution remained on paper, while practice diverged. Within 2 decades, Russia had returned to authoritarianism with democratic decoration. This isn't deterministic. Societies can surprise us, but patterns exist, and Montesquieu identified them with remarkable clarity. His framework explains why democracy succeeds in some places and fails in others better than most contemporary political science. Because he understood that politics emerges from society, not from blueprints, his influence on legal thought was equally profound. The concept of judicial independence, now considered fundamental to rule of law, draws heavily on his work. If courts are to check executive and legislative power, they must be insulated from political pressure. Judges need secure tenure. Their decisions need protection. The judiciary needs institutional autonomy. None of this was obvious. In 1748, courts were generally seen as extensions of royal power. Judges served at the monarch's pleasure. Law was a tool of governance, not a constraint on it. Montesquieu argued for something radically different. He envisioned courts as independent arbiters, applying fixed laws impartially. This required judges who couldn't be removed for unpopular decisions. It required laws that didn't change with each ruler's whim. It required a legal profession with its own standards and traditions. The English system approximated this. Common law developed through judicial decisions over centuries. Judges cited precedent, not royal will. The legal profession was organised independently through the Inns of Court. Lawyers owed primary allegiance to law itself, not to particular patrons. Montesquieu saw this as essential to English liberty. Without independent courts, there was no real law, only the preferences of whoever held power. Property rights were meaningless if officials could seize assets arbitrarily. Contracts were worthless if authorities could rewrite them. Commerce required legal predictability. Freedom required legal protection. Both required independent courts. This insight shaped constitutional design across the democratic world. The United States gave federal judges life tenure explicitly to insulate them from political pressure. France, after revolution's chaos, eventually established an independent judiciary. Even countries without formal separation of powers recognized that courts needed autonomy. The alternative was tyranny by other means. A government that controls the courts can make anything legal. It can call oppression justice. It can dress tyranny in law's clothing. Independent courts are the last defense against this. They can say no to power. They can protect the individual against the state. They can enforce the constitution against the government. Montesquieu's judges were not philosopher kings. He didn't want courts making policy or imposing their vision of the good society. He wanted them doing something simpler but more important, applying law consistently, protecting established rights, checking arbitrary power. This modest vision of judicial function has proven remarkably durable. Even countries that expanded judicial power beyond what Montesquieu envisioned, giving courts authority to review legislation and interpret constitutions broadly, still operate within his basic framework. Courts check other branches. They apply law independently. They protect individual rights against collective will. The principle holds even as applications vary, but maintaining judicial independence requires constant vigilance. Every government, even democratic ones, sometimes chafes at judicial constraints. When courts block popular policies or protect unpopular rights, pressure builds to reform the judiciary, to pack courts with friendly judges, to limit their jurisdiction, to ignore their rulings. These temptations are permanent. Montesquieu understood this. He knew that formal structures weren't self-enforcing. They required cultural support. A society that values liberty will defend judicial independence even when specific decisions disappoint. A society that values results over process will sacrifice independence for short-term gains. And once sacrificed, independence is hard to recover. Poland and Hungary in recent years demonstrate this. Both were post-communist success stories, consolidated democracies with functioning institutions. Then populist governments began undermining judicial independence. New laws changed court composition. Judges were pressured. Decisions were ignored. The formal structure remained. The reality shifted. Courts that couldn't check power effectively weren't really courts at all. They were government departments in robes. The European Union objected. International observers protested. But external pressure can only do so much. If a society's political culture doesn't value independent courts, they won't remain independent. The protection has to be internal. Citizens have to care. Lawyers have to resist. Politicians have to accept limits. When any of these fail, the system begins collapsing. Montesquieu's insights about political culture versus institutional design prove their worth repeatedly. You can't maintain free government with hostile or indifferent citizens. Constitutions are paper. Institutions are conventions. What matters is whether people value what these represent, whether they'll defend them when threatened, whether they'll tolerate the inefficiencies freedom requires. His pessimism about human nature grounded his entire political philosophy. He didn't believe people were naturally good or that education could perfect humanity. He believed we were ambitious, self-interested, prone to abuse power. This made him a realist, not a cynic. Realism meant designing systems that worked with human nature, rather than against it. Separation of powers assumes that officials will try to expand their authority. It doesn't rely on their virtue. It channels their ambition against itself. Checks and balances assume that power centers will compete. They don't depend on cooperation. They make competition productive. This explains why Montesquieu's framework survived while more idealistic alternatives failed. Systems built on assumptions of human goodness collapse when people prove flawed. Systems built on assumptions of human ambition remain functional despite our flaws. The founders of the American Republic absorbed this lesson thoroughly. Madison's famous argument in Federalist 10 and 51 reads like Montesquieu, translated into practice: ambition must be made to counteract ambition. If men were angels, no government would be necessary. The structure must supply the defect of better motives. This wasn't original philosophy, it was applied Montesquieu. But the application worked. The American system, for all its problems and contradictions, maintained divided government longer than any comparable regime. Power didn't concentrate, tyranny didn't emerge. Checks functioned, not perfectly, sometimes barely, but they held. The reason becomes clear when we examine what actually preserves constitutional systems. It isn't the document, it's the habit of respecting what the document represents. Montesquieu understood this better than most theorists. He knew that written rules meant nothing unless people acted as though they mattered, unless officials accepted limits voluntarily, unless citizens demanded accountability, unless the culture supported institutional constraints, even when they proved inconvenient. This cultural foundation takes generations to build. It requires repeated experience with a rule of law. It needs citizens who've seen arbitrary power and rejected it, who've experienced accountability and valued it, who understand viscerally that short-term gains from unchecked power produce long-term disasters. France lacked this foundation in 1789. The revolutionaries had read Montesquieu. They admired his framework. They tried implementing separation of powers in their new constitution. But the society beneath wasn't ready. Centuries of absolute monarchy had created habits of centralized authority. When crisis came, as crisis always does, people defaulted to what felt familiar. Concentration of power, executive dominance, rule by emergency decree. The forms of divided government couldn't survive the substance of unified political culture. Within years, France cycled through republics and Empires and monarchies, each regime promised stability through strong central authority. Each proved that concentration of power doesn't produce stability. It produces either tyranny or chaos, sometimes both. The pattern repeated throughout the 19th century: constitutional monarchy, revolution, republic, empire, restoration, another republic, another empire. Finally, slowly, a culture of constitutional government took root. But it required disaster after disaster. Defeat in war, occupation, collaboration, liberation. Only after World War II did France develop the political culture that could sustain divided government reliably. The current Fifth Republic, for all its quirks, maintains separation of powers more effectively than any previous French regime. Not because its constitution is better written, because the society finally accepted what constitutional government acquires. The contrast with Britain illustrates Montesquieu's point differently. Britain never had a written constitution. It developed separation of powers gradually, almost accidentally, through centuries of conflict between Crown and Parliament. No single document defined the system. Instead, conventions accumulated, precedents hardened into expectations. Political culture evolved to respect institutional boundaries, even without formal rules. The result worked. Parliament checked the Crown. Courts remained independent. Power stayed divided, not through constitutional mandate, but through cultural consensus. When Montesquieu analysed Britain, he described a system that functioned through unwritten norms rather than written law. This impressed him more than any constitution could. It demonstrated that separation of powers was fundamentally about practice, not paper, about habits, not rules, about culture, not structure. His insight explains why constitutional transplants so often fail. A developing nation adopts a constitution modelled on successful democracies. The document looks perfect: separation of powers, checks and balances, independent judiciary, federalism, all the right elements. Yet within years or decades, the system collapses into authoritarianism or gridlock, or both simultaneously. The problem isn't the Constitution. It's the absence of cultural support for what the Constitution represents. Citizens haven't internalised why divided government matters. Officials haven't accepted that institutional limits bind them. Society hasn't developed the habits that make constitutional government work. You can't import these things. They have to grow organically from experience. Montesquieu knew this. That's why he emphasised climate and culture and history alongside institutional design. He understood that the same structure produces different results in different contexts. Not because the structure changes, but because the human material it works with varies. This makes constitutional engineering frustratingly uncertain. We can identify what works, we can describe why it works, we can recommend specific institutional arrangements, but we can't guarantee success. The society receiving the advice might lack the prerequisites for implementing it. Their history might have created different habits. Their culture might resist the necessary constraints. Their circumstances might make divided government impractical. Does this mean we should abandon the effort? Montesquieu didn't think so. He believed that understanding principles of good government mattered even when application proved difficult. That knowing what preserves liberty helps even when liberty remains threatened. That clear analysis of political systems serves societies ready to use it. His own work demonstrates this. The spirit of the laws influenced constitutional thinking across centuries and continents. Not because it provided a simple blueprint, because it offered sophisticated analysis that serious reformers could adapt to their circumstances. The American founders adapted it brilliantly. The French revolutionaries misapplied it tragically. Both read the same text. The difference lay in their situations, not Montesquieu's analysis. His framework required certain conditions to function. America possessed those conditions. France didn't. Yet eventually, France developed them. partly by studying why their early attempts failed. Montesquieu's pessimism about human nature coexisted with optimism about human potential. He believed we were fundamentally flawed, prone to abuse power, incapable of sustained virtue. But he also believed we could design systems that compensated for our flaws, that recognized our weaknesses and built around them, that channeled our vices toward productive ends. This balanced view feels more relevant than ever. Modern political discourse swings between naive faith in human goodness and cynical assumption of universal corruption. Montesquieu rejected both extremes. People aren't angels, but we're not demons either. We're ambitious, self-interested, sometimes noble, often petty, always complicated. Systems that work acknowledge this complexity. They don't require saints, they don't assume villains. They structure incentives so that ordinary people pursuing ordinary goals produce reasonably good outcomes, where officials checking each other's power serves everyone's interest in preventing tyranny, where competition between institutions creates spaces for liberty, where divided government protects citizens despite flawed leaders. This approach seems modest. It is modest. Montesquieu wasn't promising utopia. He was offering incremental improvement over despotism, a system where abuse of power faced obstacles, where liberty found protection in institutional rivalry, where ordinary people could live without constant fear of arbitrary authority. That might not sound inspiring, but compared to the alternatives most humans have endured, it's extraordinary. The political theorists who promised more delivered less. Rousseau's vision of perfect democracy produced the terror. Marx's classless society produced the gulag. Utopian dreams became dystopian nightmares with disturbing regularity. Montesquieu's modest realism aged better. His framework didn't promise to perfect humanity. It offered to restrain the powerful, to divide authority, to create spaces where liberty might flourish despite human imperfection. These limited goals proved achievable. Societies that followed his advice didn't become paradises, they became places where citizens enjoyed unprecedented freedom, where government remained limited, where power stayed divided, where tyranny faced institutional obstacles. The success was real, even if incomplete. Montesquieu would have expected incomplete success. He knew that no system works perfectly, that every structure has flaws, that human ingenuity finds ways around even clever constraints, but imperfect protection beats no protection. Divided government sometimes fails. Unified government always threatens liberty. The choice isn't between perfect freedom and flawed freedom. It's between flawed freedom and reliable tyranny. His analysis of different government types reinforced this point. He examined republics, monarchies, despotisms. Each had characteristic virtues and vices. Each suited certain circumstances. Each faced particular dangers. But despotism stood apart. It was uniquely corrupting, uniquely unstable, uniquely dangerous to human flourishing. The despot wielded unlimited power. This sounds like strength. It's actually weakness. Unlimited power means unlimited responsibility. Every failure reflects on the ruler. Every problem demands his solution. Every crisis requires his attention. No human can bear this burden. The despot becomes paranoid. He sees threats everywhere. He trusts no one. He rules through fear because fear is all he has. His subjects obey from terror, not loyalty. They wait for opportunities to rebel. They undermine authority whenever possible. The regime survives through constant surveillance and periodic purges. This isn't stable government. It's permanent crisis. Montesquieu described despotism as the natural state where power concentrates absolutely, where one person rules without law or institutional constraint, where fear replaces all other political principles. He saw it in Asian empires. He saw it in moments of European history. He saw it as a permanent possibility lurking beneath every political system. The tendency toward despotism never disappears. It's always there, waiting for the right crisis or the wrong leader. What prevents it is institutional structure, division of power, separation of authorities, multiple centres of decision-making. These create friction. They slow government. They frustrate ambitious rulers. They seem inefficient, but this inefficiency is precisely the point. Efficient tyranny is still tyranny. Inefficient freedom beats efficient oppression every time. The trade-off is worth it. Montesquieu insisted on this repeatedly. Liberty requires accepting inconvenience, tolerating delays, enduring political conflict, watching policies fail, because no single authority can impose solutions. This frustrates people who want quick action, who see problems demanding immediate attention, who believe that if only the right person held power, everything could be fixed. They're wrong. The right person doesn't exist, and even if they did, concentrating power in their hands would corrupt them, or their successors, or the institution they created. The temptation to centralize authority for good purposes is permanent. It must be resisted permanently. Every crisis produces calls for emergency powers, for temporary dictators, for suspending normal procedures. Sometimes these calls seem reasonable. The crisis might be real. The danger might be urgent. Normal procedures might be too slow. But emergency powers rarely remain temporary. Temporary dictators rarely relinquish authority voluntarily. Suspended procedures often stay suspended. The crisis that justified concentration of power fades. The concentration remains. Montesquieu warned against this pattern. He'd seen it throughout history, Rome's dictatorship destroying the Republic, revolutionary France's Committee of Public Safety becoming tyrannical, every regime that promised temporary concentration of power for emergency purposes. Most never returned to divided government. The emergency became permanent. The temporary became eternal. The exception became the rule. This doesn't mean emergencies should be ignored. It means they should be handled within existing structures, through divided government, with checks and balances maintained, even when this proves difficult. The difficulty is the price of liberty. Pay it or lose what you're trying to protect. Modern democracies still struggle with this balance. Terrorism produces security measures that expand executive power. Economic crises generate demands for decisive action, unconstrained by legislative debate. Pandemics create pressure for emergency rule. Each crisis tests whether societies value divided government enough to maintain it under stress. Some pass, some fail. The ones that pass aren't necessarily stronger or richer or better governed in normal times. They're the ones where political culture deeply values institutional constraints, where citizens understand viscerally that concentrated power poses greater danger than any specific crisis, where officials accept limits even when limits seem counterproductive. This cultural foundation can't be taught in a single generation. It requires repeated experience with the consequences of unchecked power. It needs societies that have lived through tyranny and rejected it, that have seen emergency measures become permanent and learned to resist them, that understand the difference between temporary crisis response and permanent constitutional change. Montesquieu's framework helps societies think clearly about these distinctions. It provides vocabulary for analysing power. It offers principles for evaluating institutional arrangements. It explains why certain structures protect liberty while others threaten it. But it can't substitute for the cultural habits that make structures work. The same constitutional design functions differently depending on who implements it. A society habituated to divided government maintains it. A society habituated to centralized authority abandons it. The formal rules matter less than the informal practices surrounding them. This explains why constitutional reform so often disappoints. New rules don't change underlying habits. New structures don't transform political culture. Real change requires both institutional reform and cultural evolution. The institutions create frameworks. The culture determines whether frameworks function. Montesquieu gave us the analytical tools for designing good institutions, but he also warned that good design alone isn't sufficient. The society must be ready, and readiness takes time. Cultural evolution can't be rushed, but it can be guided. Montesquieu understood this. He never promised quick transformations. He never suggested that reading the right book would instantly create good government. His project was pedagogical in the deepest sense, teaching societies to see power differently, to recognize patterns they'd previously ignored, to question arrangements they'd previously accepted. This education happens gradually. A generation reads Montesquieu. They absorb his framework. They begin analyzing their own institutions through his lens. They notice concentrations of power they hadn't seen before. They understand why certain arrangements produce certain outcomes. They start conversations. They write pamphlets. They propose reforms. The next generation inherits these conversations. The framework becomes familiar. The vocabulary enters common discourse. Ideas that seemed radical become conventional wisdom. Institutional changes that seemed impossible become achievable. Not because anyone forced them, because enough people understood why they mattered. This process took decades in England. It took longer in France. It happened differently in America. Each society adapted Montesquieu's principles to its own circumstances. Each found its own path toward divided government. Each made mistakes along the way, but the direction was consistent: movement toward institutional constraints on power, away from arbitrary rule, toward predictable procedures. This movement wasn't inevitable. Many societies read Montesquieu without implementing his ideas. Many understood his principles without accepting them. Understanding doesn't guarantee agreement. Some political cultures resist divided government. They prefer unified command. They distrust institutional constraints. They view checks and balances as obstacles rather than protections. For these societies, Montesquieu's framework explains why their governments function as they do, but it doesn't persuade them to change. The analytical tools work regardless of political preference. You can use Montesquieu's categories to understand any government. You can map its power structures. You can predict its tendencies. You can identify its vulnerabilities. Whether you approve of what you find is a separate question. This analytical neutrality makes Montesquieu's work powerful across political divides. Conservatives use his framework to defend traditional institutions. Progressives use it to critique concentrations of wealth and power. Libertarians use it to argue for minimal government. Each group finds support for different conclusions, but they share common vocabulary. They analyze power using similar categories. They recognize the same structural patterns even when they evaluate them differently. This shared framework enables productive disagreement. When people argue about whether some institution concentrates too much power, they're at least arguing about the same thing. They agree on what constitutes concentration. They differ on where to draw lines. That's genuine debate. Not talking past each other. Not using incompatible frameworks. Not arguing about fundamentally different conceptions of government. The alternative is worse. Without shared categories for analysing power, political debate becomes chaotic. People advocate positions without understanding their institutional implications. They support measures that undermine their own goals. They oppose measures that would advance their values, all because they lack tools for thinking clearly about power. Montesquieu provided those tools. His framework continues working 3 centuries later, not because he solved every problem, not because his specific proposals always succeeded, because he gave us categories for thinking, ways of analysing government that transcend particular historical moments, principles that apply to monarchy and democracy alike. Now we turn to Montesquieu's greatest practical legacy, the thing that made his abstract theorizing matter in the real world, his influence on the American founding. The men who gathered in Philadelphia in 1787 knew Montesquieu intimately. They'd read him, they'd debated him, they'd absorbed his framework so thoroughly that it shaped how they thought about their task. When they designed the Constitution, they built directly on his principles, not slavishly copying, not implementing every detail, but using his categories, working within his framework, accepting his core insights about power. James Madison was particularly steeped in Montesquieu. His notes from the Constitutional Convention show constant engagement with the spirit of the laws. When Madison argued for separation of powers, he cited Montesquieu. When he explained why different branches needed different constituencies, he invoked Montesquieu's logic. When he defended checks and balances against critics who called them inefficient, he used Montesquieu's reasoning. Madison understood what Montesquieu had shown, that liberty requires institutional friction, that efficiency in government often means efficiency in oppressing, that the point isn't smooth operation but prevented abuse. The Constitution embodies this understanding. Its structure deliberately creates obstacles to action. 3 branches with different powers, different terms of office, different constituencies, different selection methods. Each branch can check the others. None can act alone. The system makes quick, decisive action difficult, exactly as intended. Critics immediately attacked this design. They wanted more unified government, faster decision-making, less institutional friction. They saw the Constitution's complexity as a flaw. Madison saw it as essential protection. His response to these critics became the Federalist Papers, co-authored with Alexander Hamilton and John Jay, a systematic defense of the Constitution's structure, and an extended meditation on Montesquieu's principles. Federalist 47 directly addresses separation of powers. Madison quotes Montesquieu extensively. He explains why accumulation of legislative, executive, and judicial power in the same hands constitutes tyranny. He shows how the Constitution prevents such accumulation. He answers critics who claim the branches aren't sufficiently separated. The answer reveals Madison's sophistication. Perfect separation is impossible. The branches must interact. They must share some powers. But the key is preventing any branch from controlling another, preventing accumulation, maintaining balance. Federalist 51 explains the mechanism. Ambition must be made to counteract ambition. Each branch needs weapons to defend itself against encroachment. Not just formal powers, but institutional interests, reasons to resist the others. The genius lies in harnessing self-interest for constitutional purposes. Representatives want to maintain their branch's power, not from noble motives necessarily, from ordinary ambition, from desire for influence, from institutional pride. This self-interest becomes the system's defense mechanism. Each branch guards its prerogatives jealously. Each resists encroachment automatically. The Constitution doesn't rely on virtue. It harnesses vice. It makes ambition defend liberty. It turns self-interest into constitutional guardian. This is pure Montesquieu. Don't expect angels to govern. Don't rely on good intentions. Build structures that work with human nature as it is. Use people's actual motivations to create desired outcomes. The system should function even when operated by ambitious, self-interested, power-hungry individuals. Perhaps especially then, because that's who will inevitably end up operating it. The other founders shared this understanding. John Adams had written extensively on government before the convention. His defense of the constitutions of government drew heavily on Montesquieu. Adams believed in balanced government, mixing elements of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy, each checking the others, none dominating. Thomas Jefferson was in France during the convention, but he'd absorbed Montesquieu years earlier. His correspondence shows constant engagement with the spirit of the laws. When he later critiqued aspects of the Constitution, he used Montesquieu's framework. Even Alexander Hamilton, who favoured stronger central government than most founders, argued within Montesquieu's categories. Hamilton wanted more executive power, but he accepted the need for institutional constraints. He defended the constitution structure, even when he wished it granted more authority to his preferred branch. This consensus on framework didn't mean agreement on every detail. The founders fought bitterly over specifics. How much power should the executive have? How should senators be chosen? What role for states? Should there be a Bill of Rights? These debates were genuine, but they happened within shared assumptions about power's nature. All parties accepted that power must be divided. All agreed that accumulation threatened liberty. All understood that structures must check ambition with ambition. They disagreed about where to draw lines, not about whether lines should exist. This made compromise possible. When people share fundamental principles, they can negotiate details. When they differ on basics, negotiation becomes impossible. The Constitution emerged from shared framework, enabling specific compromises, and that framework came from Montesquieu, not exclusively. The founders drew on many sources: English constitutional history, classical republicanism, their own colonial experience, but Montesquieu provided the systematic theory. His influence appears throughout the Constitution structure: bicameral legislature, presidential veto, judicial review. Each reflects his principles. Each implements his insights about preventing concentration. The Bill of Rights added another layer: explicit protections for specific liberties, limits on what government can do even when branches agree. This went beyond Montesquieu's focus, but it complemented his approach. Structural protections backed by enumerated rights. The combination proved powerful. America's constitutional system has survived 2 centuries. Not without problems, not without crises, but it's maintained divided government. It's prevented the tyranny that destroyed other republics. It's preserved liberty better than most alternatives. This success isn't purely institutional. American political culture matters enormously. The habit of accepting electoral defeat, the tradition of peaceful transfer of power, the commitment to constitutional procedures. These cultural practices make the structures work. Without them, the same institutions would fail. But the institutions shape the culture. They teach citizens to expect divided government. They normalize institutional friction. They make checks and balances seem natural rather than obstacles. The Constitution doesn't just constrain power. It educates people about why constraints matter. This educational function was crucial for Montesquieu. He wasn't just designing institutions, he was teaching societies to think differently about government, to see power as dangerous even when wielded by good people, to value procedures that slow decision-making, to prefer inefficient liberty over efficient tyranny. These lessons took root in America. They spread through American political culture. They shaped how generations of citizens understood their government. When Americans complain about gridlock, they're usually complaining about Montesquieu's principles in action. The system is working as designed, making unified action difficult, requiring broad consensus for major changes, forcing compromise. The frustration is the point. Government should be frustrating. Action should be difficult. Power should face resistance. This isn't dysfunction. It's the price of liberty. Americans don't always appreciate this. Each generation rediscovers the appeal of decisive government. Each crisis produces calls for cutting through institutional barriers. Each period of divided government generates frustration with checks and balances, but the system persists, the structures remain, the constraints hold, not perfectly, not without violation, but well enough to prevent lasting tyranny. This persistence demonstrates Montesquieu's enduring relevance. His insights about power haven't aged. His warnings remain valid. His framework still helps us understand why governments succeed or fail in protecting liberty. The American experiment proves his principles can work. That divided government can function. That institutional constraints can preserve freedom. That liberty and effective government aren't incompatible. They just require accepting friction. Other nations have followed America's example. Many modern democracies incorporate separation of powers. They divide government among branches. They create checks and balances. They structure institutions to prevent concentration. Not all succeed equally. Some maintain divisions effectively. Others see them erode. The difference usually comes down to political culture. Whether citizens value constraints enough to defend them, whether officials accept limits even when limits prove inconvenient, whether society prefers divided government to unified control. Montesquieu shaped this culture through his writing, through his analysis, through his warnings about power's tendency to concentrate. His work taught generations to value institutional friction, to see constraints as protective rather than obstructive, to prefer messy liberty over orderly tyranny. This cultural influence extends beyond formal institutions. It affects how we think about authority generally, about organizational design, about any system where power exists. Modern corporations often divide authority deliberately, separating operational control from strategic oversight, creating checks through board structures, requiring multiple approvals for major decisions. This mirrors Montesquieu's principles applied to private governance. Universities do something similar. Faculty governance balances administrative authority. Tenure protects against concentrated power over academic freedom. Committee structures distribute decision-making. These aren't accidents. They reflect lessons about preventing tyranny that Montesquieu articulated. Even informal organizations adopt these patterns. Volunteer groups create bylaws limiting leadership authority. Community associations divide responsibilities among officers. Social movements develop internal checks to prevent domination. The insight that power corrupts has become common sense. We instinctively distrust concentrated authority. We automatically seek balance. We naturally prefer divided control. This instinct owes much to Montesquieu. He made the case systematically. He provided the framework. He showed why distribution protects better than concentration. His legacy appears in unexpected places. International organizations like the European Union deliberately fragment power. Member states retain sovereignty. Decisions require consensus. No single institution dominates. This reflects Montesquieu's principles operating at supranational scale. The United Nations does something similar. Security Council power balanced against General Assembly representation. Secretariat implementation checked by member state control. Specialized agencies operating independently. The whole system designed to prevent any nation or bloc from dominating. These structures frustrate people constantly. International institutions move slowly. They require endless negotiation. They rarely act decisively. They produce compromises nobody loves. But they preserve independence. They prevent domination. They protect smaller powers from larger ones. They make tyranny difficult, even when powerful nations want unified action. The frustration is the design working. Montesquieu would recognize the pattern. He'd see his principles adapted to new contexts. He'd understand why the friction matters. The alternative to frustrating divided authority isn't efficient, benevolent government. It's efficient tyranny. History demonstrates this repeatedly. Whenever institutions consolidate power quickly and act decisively without friction, liberty suffers. The speed comes at freedom's expense. The efficiency enables oppression. The unified action crushes dissent. Montesquieu understood this trade-off intuitively. He'd lived through enough French history to see concentrated power's results. He'd studied enough other societies to recognize the pattern. He'd thought deeply enough to articulate why it happens. His genius was making the implicit explicit, taking observations that many people shared and building them into systematic theory, showing not just that tyranny follows concentration, but why it must follow, the mechanisms through which unified authority becomes oppressive. This theoretical contribution matters beyond practical application. It changed how political thinkers approached their subject. Before Montesquieu, most focused on who should rule, kings or aristocrats or people. His question was different. How should rule be structured? What institutional arrangements preserve liberty regardless of who holds office? This shift in perspective transformed political science. It made institutions central to analysis. It focused attention on constitutional design. It suggested that proper structures could protect freedom even with imperfect leaders. The optimism here is limited but real. Montesquieu didn't believe perfect government was possible. He didn't think human nature would improve. He didn't expect leaders to become selfless. But he believed good institutional design could channel ambition productively, could make self-interest serve public good, could prevent worst-case outcomes even with mediocre officials. America's founders shared this limited optimism. They didn't expect virtuous leaders. They designed for ambitious ones. They assumed officials would seek power and tried to make that seeking check itself. This Montesquieuan realism pervades the Constitution. Its clauses don't appeal to better angels. They assume worse devils and try to contain them. They accept human nature as flawed and work within that constraint. The result isn't utopian, it's merely less tyrannical than alternatives. That modest achievement represents enormous progress. Most societies throughout history have lived under despotism. Liberty has been rare. Divided government, rarer still. That any system preserves freedom over generations deserves recognition. Montesquieu provided intellectual tools for this achievement. His analysis showed why division matters. His examples demonstrated possibility. His warnings motivated action. The spirit of laws remains relevant because power remains dangerous. Technology changes, economies evolve, cultures shift, but authority's tendency to concentrate persists. Human ambition continues. The temptation to dominate endures. Montesquieu's insights apply because the underlying problem hasn't changed. Every generation must relearn his lessons, must rediscover why constraints matter, must resist the appeal of unified decisive government, must accept frustration as freedom's price. This relearning happens through experience. Democratic societies periodically flirt with concentrated power. Crises produce demands for strong leadership. Emergencies justify bypassing normal procedures. Temporary measures become permanent. Constraints erode, then consequences follow. Authority abuses mount. Liberty contracts. Dissent faces suppression. Eventually, society remembers why limits existed, why friction served purpose, why division protected freedom. The pendulum swings back. Constraints rebuild. Separation strengthens. Balance restores. This cycle demonstrates Montesquieu's enduring relevance. His warnings need repeating because temptations recur. His framework needs teaching because each generation faces similar choices. His principles need defending because power never stops seeking consolidation. Modern threats to separation differ from 18th century versions. Administrative agencies accumulate legislative and judicial functions. Executive orders bypass normal lawmaking. Judicial activism blurs branches. Party polarization reduces friction between aligned branches. National security concerns justify concentration. These developments concern defenders of divided government. They see Montesquieu's warnings coming true. They worry about creeping consolidation. They fear losing protections that previous generations established. But the system persists. Checks operate, balances function, perhaps less perfectly than before, perhaps with more erosion than comfortable, but substantially intact. Courts still constrain executives, legislatures still check presidents, states still limit federal power. The structure holds. This resilience suggests Montesquieu was right about institutional design's importance, that properly constructed systems resist concentration even under pressure, that structural protections matter beyond cultural commitment. America's experience also reveals limits. Institutions alone don't guarantee liberty. They must be defended actively. Norms must support formal rules. Citizens must value constraints enough to resist erosion. Officials must accept limits even when limits prove inconvenient. Without these cultural supports, the same institutional structure would fail. Montesquieu understood this. He emphasized that different societies need different arrangements, that institutions must fit political culture, that transplanting structures without compatible customs produces poor results. Many nations adopted American-style constitutions. They created separated powers. They established checks and balances. They wrote protections into law. But outcomes varied enormously. Some maintained division effectively. Others saw concentration despite formal structures. The difference usually traced to political culture, whether societies valued constraints, whether officials accepted limits, whether citizens defended institutional boundaries. This doesn't diminish institutional importance. Good structures make maintenance easier. They create expectations. They establish procedures. They provide tools for resistance. But structures need defending. They require vigilance. They demand effort. Liberty never becomes automatic. Montesquieu knew this. His work wasn't utopian. He didn't promise permanent solutions. He offered tools for ongoing struggle. His legacy lives in that struggle, in every debate about executive power, in every dispute over judicial review, in every conflict between branches, in every tension between levels of government. These fights aren't dysfunction. They're the system working. They're Montesquieu's principles in action. They're liberty defending itself through institutional friction. Understanding this transforms how we view political conflict. Gridlock becomes protection. Stalemate becomes safety. Frustration becomes freedom's price. The alternative isn't efficient, benevolent government serving public good. It's efficient tyranny serving rulers' interests. History teaches this lesson repeatedly. Montesquieu articulated why. His analysis remains unrefuted. Power concentrated becomes power abused. Authority unified becomes authority oppressive. Government unchecked becomes government tyrannical. These aren't possibilities. They're near certainties. Human nature makes them so. Ambition makes them so. The absence of angels makes them so. Therefore, division matters. Separation protects. Checks preserve. Balances maintain. Friction serves. These aren't elegant solutions. They don't produce decisive leadership. They don't enable quick action. They don't satisfy desires for strong government. But they preserve liberty better than alternatives. They prevent tyranny more effectively than trust. They protect freedom more reliably than hoping for virtue. Montesquieu taught us to prefer messy liberty over orderly oppression, to value institutional friction over governmental efficiency, to accept frustration as freedom's cost. These lessons remain vital. They need teaching to each generation. They require defending against each threat. They demand relearning through each crisis. The spirit of laws endures because its subject endures, because power remains dangerous, because liberty needs protecting, because tyranny never stops threatening. His work provides tools for this ongoing defense. His analysis illuminates current struggles. His warnings guide modern choices. His framework structures our thinking. When we debate executive authority, we're having Montesquieu's conversation. When we discuss judicial independence, we're applying his principles. When we defend institutional separation, we're following his guidance. His ghost haunts every constitutional controversy. His logic underlies every separation argument. His insights inform every defense of divided government. This makes him perpetually relevant, not as historical curiosity, not as intellectual ancestor, but as active participant in ongoing debates. His questions remain our questions. His concerns remain our concerns. His solutions remain our best available options. 2 centuries haven't produced better answers to power's danger. Technology hasn't changed authority's nature. Progress hasn't eliminated ambition's threat. Human nature persists. Power corrupts. Concentration enables tyranny. Therefore, division protects. This logic holds today as firmly as when Montesquieu wrote. The specific threats differ. The institutional forms evolve. The cultural context changes. But the underlying dynamic remains. Authority seeks consolidation. Liberty requires resistance. Structures provide tools. Citizens must wield them. Understanding Montesquieu helps this wielding. His work teaches why constraints matter. His examples show what works. His warnings motivate vigilance. His legacy isn't just historical, it's practical guidance for present struggles. Every time we defend institutional boundaries, we're vindicating his analysis. Every time we resist concentrated power, we're proving his point. Every time we prefer divided government, we're choosing his vision. That vision shaped modern liberty. It designed America's Constitution. It inspired countless other systems. It provided intellectual foundation for limited government. More importantly, it taught generations to think correctly about power, to see danger in concentration, to value friction, to prefer separation, to accept frustration. These mental habits matter as much as formal institutions. They create culture supporting constitutional structures. They motivate defense of threatened constraints. They sustain vigilance across generations. Montesquieu planted these habits through compelling analysis, through systematic argument, through historical demonstration, through logical proof. His work convinced readers that liberty requires division, that freedom needs friction, that safety demands separation. These convictions became common sense among educated people. They spread through political culture. They shaped constitutional design worldwide. They continue influencing debates today. That represents extraordinary intellectual achievement. One thinker articulating principles that reshape how societies organize power. One book providing framework that guides centuries of practice. One analysis that remains relevant across vast changes in technology and culture. The spirit of laws earned this influence through rigorous thinking, through careful observation, through honest analysis, through compelling argument. Montesquieu didn't just assert his conclusions, he built them methodically from evidence and logic. He showed his work, he invited scrutiny, he made his case. That case has withstood 250 years of testing. His principles remain sound, his warnings remain valid, his framework remains useful, his legacy remains active. We're still learning from him, still applying his insights, still defending his principles, still fighting the battles he identified. That makes him not just influential, but essential. Not just important, but indispensable. Not just relevant, but vital. Understanding political liberty requires understanding Montesquieu. Defending constitutional government requires applying his principles. Preserving freedom requires heeding his warnings. His work isn't optional reading for specialists. It's necessary knowledge for citizens. Anyone who votes participates in governance, shaped by his insights. Anyone who debates politics uses concepts he articulated. Anyone who values liberty benefits from structures he helped design. This makes his legacy universal within free societies. It extends beyond scholars and lawyers. It reaches every person living under divided governments. They inhabit institutions reflecting his vision, whether they know his name or not. The separation protecting their freedom implements his principles. The checks preserving their rights apply his framework. The constraints preventing tyranny follow his logic. Montesquieu's ghost walks through every constitutional democracy. His ideas animate their structures. His warnings guide their defences. His vision defines their aspirations. That's the measure of profound influence, not fame, not recognition, but shaping reality itself, creating institutions, embodying principles, establishing systems, implementing insights, building structures, protecting values. Montesquieu achieved this. His analysis became architecture, his arguments became constitutions, his warnings became safeguards. The world he shaped persists, the liberty he defended endures, the tyranny he prevented hasn't triumphed. That's legacy worth celebrating. That's influence worth understanding. That's achievement worth studying. The spirit of laws lives in every free government, in every separated power, in every balanced authority, in every checked ambition. There his work continues. There his vision endures. There his legacy protects. Charles Louis II died in a rented room in Paris in February 1755. The funeral was modest. A few friends attended. The priest performed the necessary rituals. The body was laid to rest. Within days, the city moved on. Other books appeared. Other controversies erupted. Other thinkers captured attention. But something had changed that wouldn't change back. Walk through the halls of power in Washington today. Listen to debates about executive overreach. Watch confirmation hearings for judges. Follow disputes between Congress and the presidency. Every argument echoes the Baron from Bordeaux, who never held office, never led armies, never ruled anything except his own vineyards. His framework became invisible through success. We don't cite Montesquieu when we discuss whether the president can bypass Congress. We don't reference him during debates about judicial independence. We don't quote him when arguing about federalism. But we're using his categories, operating within his logic, fighting battles he identified. That's deeper influence than fame. Fame means people know your name. Influence means they think your thoughts without realizing it. Consider what he actually did. He took observations everyone could make about power corrupting and built a systematic explanation. He showed why concentration leads to tyranny. He demonstrated how division preserves liberty. He provided tools for constructing governments that work with human nature rather than against it. Nothing about this was obvious before he explained it. Unified authority seemed natural. Strong government seemed desirable. Quick decisions seemed valuable. He showed why these intuitions misled, why apparent strength conceals weakness, why efficiency enables oppression. The American founders absorbed these lessons completely. Madison, Hamilton, Adams, Jefferson. They disagreed about details but shared Montesquieu's framework. The Constitution they created embedded his principles so thoroughly that Americans argue about his ideas while forgetting his name. 3 branches, separated powers, checks and balances, federalism dividing authority vertically as separation divides it horizontally. Every structural feature reflects his analysis. Does it work perfectly? Obviously not. Does it prevent all tyranny? Clearly not. Does it maintain liberty better than unified government? History suggests yes. Compare nations that divided power against those that concentrated it. Compare constitutional democracies against dictatorships. Compare governments with independent courts against those where judges serve rulers. The pattern Montesquieu predicted appears consistently. This doesn't make him infallible. His specific claims about climate and culture don't hold up. His generalizations about religion oversimplify. His faith that commercial society naturally produces liberty proved optimistic. But his core insight remains unrefuted. Concentrated power becomes abusive power. Division protects better than trust. Modern threats look different from 18th century versions. Administrative agencies blur separation. Executive orders bypass legislatures. National security justifies secrecy. Technology enables surveillance. Party polarization reduces friction between aligned branches. Yet the framework still helps. It identifies where power concentrates. It shows which institutions need strengthening. It explains why certain developments threaten liberty. It provides vocabulary for defending constraints. Every generation must relearn these lessons, must resist the appeal of decisive government, must accept frustration as freedom's price, must defend institutions that seem inefficient. The temptation to centralize authority never disappears. The crisis that justifies emergency powers always arrives. The leader who promises to cut through gridlock always emerges. Montesquieu's warnings matter because these patterns recur. His analysis remains relevant because power's nature hasn't changed. His framework stays useful because the problems persist. He gave us tools for ongoing struggle, not permanent solutions, not guaranteed outcomes, just better odds, clearer thinking, sounder principles. That's what intellectual achievement looks like. Not solving problems forever, but providing frameworks that help each generation address them. Not ending tyranny, but making it harder. Not guaranteeing liberty, but showing how to protect it. The baron who never travelled past Germany reshaped how half the world governs itself. The aristocrat who spent decades managing vineyards designed structures that outlasted empires. The scholar who wrote in French created concepts that translated into every language where freedom matters. His books gather dust in libraries. His name appears in footnotes. His face adorns no currency. But his ideas animate every constitutional democracy. His logic underlies every defense of separation. His warnings guide every resistance to concentrated power. That's the long shadow. Not fame, not monuments, but shaping reality itself, changing how societies organize authority, providing tools that protect liberty across centuries. Walk into any legislature where representatives check executives. Stand in any courtroom where judges rule against governments. Watch any election where losers accept defeat because procedures matter more than outcomes. There Montesquieu's work continues. The spirit of laws isn't in libraries, it's in structures, in institutions, in habits of thought that make tyranny difficult and liberty possible. He saw what others missed, that freedom requires friction, that efficiency can enable oppression, that the best defense against concentrated power is divided power. That institutional design matters as much as who governs. These insights seem obvious now. They weren't obvious then. Someone had to think them clearly, argue them systematically, demonstrate them historically, articulate them persuasively. One provincial aristocrat did that, changed everything, then died quietly while his ideas travelled the world, crossed oceans, inspired revolutions, designed constitutions, protected liberty. 250 years later, we're still living in the world he helped create, still using the tools he forged, still fighting the battles he identified, still defending the principles he articulated. The shadow stretches long indeed.